So we are now going to deal with one of the major part of this course. I think this is the major part of the course. So please take some time to go through these videos, my notes and PowerPoint at least, to get the knowledge or the wisdom required from this book. I would recommend you to think about how this book will influence your managerial life in the future. How you can have a crisis management team or crisis management plan in your organization. Not only for COVID. COVID is, I think, slowly we are coming out of it. But any crisis for that matter, this book is one of the best in the market talking about crisis management. The whole idea about this course was actually derived from this book to start with, because how to manage during something which is not expected, or how to be proactive, and at the same time, if something happens, how to manage it, how to manage the crisis. First, let's start with definitions. Crisis management is a strategic process that begins long before the first crisis in the organization. It's an activity that must be planned both before and after the crisis event. This book helps managers prepare more effectively for crisis events in their organizations. While insurance can help organizations cover losses from many crisis events, it does not replace the effective crisis management. So there are two broad approaches to managing crisis. Try to keep them from occurring, and mitigate the impact when a crisis occurs. So if you are learning from the crisis, you should be able to tackle it better next time. Or learn from somebody else's experience to tackle it better when it occurs. A framework is suggested that examines crisis management in 4 distinct phases, including the internal and external dimensions, which is called landscapes. The word crisis is often used interchangeably with other terms, including disaster, business interruption, catastrophe, emergency, or contingency. Definition of crisis management by Pearson and Clare is that it's an organizational crisis. An organizational crisis is a low probability, high impact event that threatens the viability of the organization and is characterized by ambiguity of cause, effect, and means of resolution, as well as by a belief that the decisions must be made swiftly. So we have to look at certain things. One, it is a low probable event. Then the popular notion is why we should plan for something based, if its probability won't occur, there is lesser chance of it occurring anyway. The ambiguity of cause is another thing. The ambiguity of the cause means the origin and effects of the crisis might not be known initially. Think about pandemic, COVID. Did we expect this type of effect in the beginning stages? No. So that is one of the ambiguity of causes. Means the human instinct is to quickly point out something that may have triggered the crisis, including stakeholders such as managers or company owners who might have been negligent. The ambiguity of cause also implies that the means of resolving the crisis may be multifaceted. Several viable options may be available for crisis management team to mitigate the crisis. So the definition of crisis management by Timothy Coombs, 2015, is a crisis is the perception of an unpredictable event that threatens the important expectancies of stakeholders related to health, safety, environmental, and economic issues. It can severely impact an organization's performance and generate negative outcomes. Coombs infers that not all stakeholders will receive a crisis that is occurring or perceive that a crisis is occurring. So for example, a product defect detected by customers, not by individuals inside the company, is an example of incongruity that can occur. Definition of crisis management suggested by the authors of the textbook. A crisis is an event that has low probability of occurring, but should it happen, can negatively impact the organization. The cause of a crisis and the appropriate response may not be apparent. Nonetheless, it should be resolved as quickly as possible. Finally, the crisis impact may not be initially evident to all relevant stakeholders in the organization. As I told, we were not expecting so much, loss from pandemic when it was starting. See how it expanded, how it affected several stakeholders in its course of time. So a critical characteristic of a crisis that it is rarely occurring, or it rarely just occurs without warning. Instead, many preconditions or vulnerabilities usually exist that form a breeding ground for the crisis. Some management scholars investigate similar issues under the realm of error management. Errors in organizations are unintended deviations from the established goals and standards existing in the organizations that can lead to either positive or negative consequences. So any deviation from the normal, that's what we're talking about. Like crisis, errors are often but not always avoidable. That is one of the problems in crisis, especially natural disasters. The four stages in the life cycle of a crisis are preconditions, the trigger event, the crisis itself, and the aftermath. So, precondition means Smith 1990 pointed out that a set of similar events typically interact before a crisis occurs. The combination of events eventually leads to a significant occurrence, commonly called the trigger event, which actually causes the crisis to commence. For example, trigger event at the Union Carbide tragedy in India in 1984 was water entering into the gas storage tank that subsequently caused tank temperature to rise. Numerous preconditions contributed to the origin of the accident, including shutting down a refrigerating system, failure to reset the tank temperature alarm, operating with a non-functioning gas scrubber, and not repairing an inoperative flame tower designed to burn off the toxic gases. So there are several events or several preconditions contributed to the actual one. The trigger event is the point where the crisis escalates and upsets the healthy equilibrium of the organization. Preconditions brew beneath the surface, leading to the trigger event. Then the actual crisis happens. The escalation of the crisis produces the most significant impact and damage to the organization and its stakeholders. Damage can be extensive due to this acute stage of crisis and can significantly affect the business or organization's operating continuity. So these things will affect the operations of the organizations or operating continuity of the organizations. So the post-crisis is after the acute phase of the crisis is over, management should reflect on the event and identify the changes that can prevent or mitigate the effects of future crisis events. So when a crisis occurs, specific individuals in organization, perhaps those on an established crisis management team, convene to minimize the damage and present a positive image to the public. Special attention should be given to supply chain decisions you are making as they have long-term ratifications. So when you're at a strategical level, when you're thinking of strategic orientation, you should be thinking about supply chain decisions especially, and especially at the sourcing level. And also you have specific individuals dealing with the media, because it can, if anything said improperly or insensitively, can cause reputation, damage to a reputation or damage to the company for a longer time. So the Goodman identified three types. Now we are looking at the classification of crisis. Goodman 1991 identified three types of crisis: accidents, product and safety health incidents, and scandals. Pearson and Mitroff 1993 framework identified 7 crisis families: economic attacks, environmental accidents, occupational health diseases, psycho events, example, terrorism, sabotage, and product tampering, damage to the reputation, informational attacks, and breaks or break-ins. Myers 1993 offered a framework of crisis consisting of three things: natural disasters, that is floods and hurricanes, etc., environmental events, aircraft accidents, contamination events, explosions, etc., and again insider events like sabotage and vandalism. Coombs in 2006 classified crisis on the three: attack on organizations, basically attack from outside of the organizations, computer hacking or tampering and things like that. When things go wrong, that is often arise from the operational problems in the operational problems in the company. When the organization misbehaves, that is mostly not addressing the known risks, improper job performances leading to accidents, legal and regulatory violations. Again, if you are looking for examples, again, go back to the textbook. You have a lot of examples. I'm not dealing with in the slides because it will be not be concise. So whenever you have something, you won't have some examples required or need more details, please refer back to the text. Mitroff, Diamond, and Alpasian 2006 identified 7 types of crises: criminal activities, massacres, etc., informational crisis, identity theft, fraud, etc., building safety issues, discovery of mold in the buildings, athletic scandals. Mainly universities have that problem with athletic scandals, sex scandals, and so on. Public health problems like example COVID-19, unethical behavior or misconduct, plagiarism is an example. Financial crisis, natural disasters, legal labor disputes, and reputation problems. These are all the division according to Mitroff, Diamond, and Alpasian. It's important, remember this, it is impossible to prepare for every crisis that might occur, but preparing for several families is feasible. Okay, so if you are prepared for something, it can actually carry on to some issues too. If you have a proper ethical standard in the organization, there will be lesser chance of any scandals. So things like that. The most basic framework, we are looking at now frameworks. The most basic framework is a simple 3-stage approach that follows a pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis. Smith 1990 offered a 3-stage format: pre-crisis period, that is the crisis management, crisis period, the operational crisis, and the post-crisis, the crisis of legitimation. Once the crisis is undergoing, the organization manages the crisis as best as it can during the operational crisis. The crisis of legitimation stage can include scapegoating other individuals in the organization. Richardson's 1994 3-step framework include pre-crisis, disaster phase, focusing on the prevention, and crisis impact or rescue stage where the crisis happens, and the recovery or demise stage involving restoring stakeholder confidence in the organization. 4-stage framework is also there by Myers 1993. The normal operation stage, that is preparations made to address the crisis. Emergency response stage, where activities in the first hours following the crisis. Then there's interim processing stage, the intermediate phase where temporary procedures are established under normal operations can resume. And finally, the restoration stage, back to normal operations. Fling 1996 had another framework. One is it is prodromal stage, actual crisis stage, chronic crisis stage, resolution stage. This is a 4-stage crisis. Okay, so prodromal stage is before the full-blown crisis and contains warning signs that signal a crisis. Actual crisis stage is the actual crisis stage where the crisis happens. Chronic crisis stage is an organization attempting to address the damages, and the resolution stage is when the organization returns to pre-crisis existence. There are 5-stage frameworks also. One is by Pearson and Mitroff's: signal detection, preparation bar prevention, containment bar or damage limitation, recovery, and learning. So the learning, I think, is the addition. Then this final, the book chapter ends with a framework suggested by the authors. It includes both external and internal landscape that engulf the organization. Internal landscape exists within the organization and consists of employees and organizational culture within the organization. And the external landscape includes stakeholders with some vested interest in the organization, but is not directly part of it. Example, customers, governmental agencies, etc. The progression of the crisis stages in the crisis management follows a 4-phase sequence. One is the landscape surveys, because where we have to identify the crisis threats. The question need to be asked include what crisis threats exist inside of the organization, what crisis threats exist outside of our organization. So again, we are dealing with any crisis now. So this book is more equipping you with the crisis management of any such crisis, any type of crisis in the future. And COVID, of course, pandemic management was definitely a crisis worth investigating. The strategic planning, preparing for a potential crisis, that is the strategic planning phase or the stage. The crisis management planning begins with a crisis management team, CMT, whose task is periodically to assess potential crises that may occur to the organization, whether it's inside or outside. The crisis management team forms crisis management plans for managing a crisis. Example, who should address the media and managing the specific crisis that is unique to the organization. So if you do not have one, start thinking about it. These type of books are encouraging you to start something in your organization to manage crisis, whether it's inside or outside. Now the third stage is crisis management stage, handling acute stages of the crisis. Focus on efforts on addressing the crisis and resuming the operations as quickly as possible. Involves managing various primary and secondary stakeholders. And the fourth one is organizational learning, becoming more effective. More likely that when managers evaluate the response quickly before they forget the details. During the forgetful stage, the organization has returned to normal operations. So basically you should be doing it before the forgetful stage, and then what happens is that the managers becomes less motivated to evaluate and learn from the crisis. So it should be done as early as possible. Learning should focus on what can be done to mitigate the impact of the similar crisis in the future. So we have to learn from what happened in the past and then use to prevent it altogether or lessen their impact. Management can identify which one they handled correctly and which one they didn't, because over the crisis management, many things management would have done correctly and some of them would not have been done correctly. So you have to identify which one they did correctly and which one they didn't. And such an evaluation can be examined in terms of degree of success and failure also. Or you can say that, oh, this thing we completely successful in managing and this one we failed. And learning to examine failures, then once the failures are there, then you have to examine the failures in management, help being proactive in the future. So you will be able to handle this more effectively in the future if you learn to examine the failures. Again, you have to also learn from successes too, so that you can replicate that in the future too. Learning organizations change policies and procedures when necessary and apply that knowledge to future crisis events. So what they're doing is they are going to learning organization, what they do is they learn from their mistakes or they learn from failures and also successes, and they make changes in the policies and procedures and accordingly, so that they can tackle the crisis in the future very successfully. So this is the first chapter where we are introducing to the frameworks and the types of crisis, and we are going to deal with furthermore regarding crisis management and crisis in the subsequent chapters. Thank you very much.